June 9, 1994. San Clemente, California. The Pacific Ocean breeze drifted through the windows of a beautiful seaside home as morning light filtered across expensive furniture and carefully arranged family photos. In one of the bedrooms, a woman who had gone to sleep healthy and happy would never wake up again. Linda Curry, 41 years old, successful, beloved by friends and family, was found motionless in her bed by her husband Paul. No signs of struggle. No obvious illness. No warning. She simply closed her eyes one night and never opened them again. How does a vibrant woman in the prime of her life just stop breathing? How does someone with no known health problems, no history of heart disease, no medications that could cause complications, simply die in her sleep? The paramedics couldn't explain it. The doctors couldn't explain it. But someone in that house knew exactly why Linda Curry would never see another sunrise. What you're about to hear is a story that took 16 years to unravel, a case so dark and calculated that it changed everything investigators thought they knew about the person sleeping next to you. Because sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the night. It comes from the person who promised to love you forever. Linda Curry was everything you'd want in a friend, a colleague, a partner. At 41, she had built a successful career in real estate, earning the respect of clients who trusted her judgment and colleagues who admired her work ethic. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who asked about your children, who made time for others even when her own schedule was packed. Linda had a laugh that could fill a room and a warmth that made everyone feel welcome. She volunteered at local charities, hosted dinner parties that friends still talk about decades later, and had a way of making ordinary moments feel special. She lived in a stunning home overlooking the Pacific Ocean in San Clemente, one of California's most desirable coastal communities. The house was a testament to success: granite countertops, panoramic ocean views, manicured gardens that Linda tended herself. To the outside world, Linda Curry had it all. And then there was Paul. Paul Curry was 42, a nuclear engineer who worked at the San Onofre nuclear generating station just up the coast. His colleagues respected his technical expertise and attention to detail. He was the kind of person who could explain complex scientific concepts with ease, who approached problems methodically, who never seemed to make impulsive decisions. Paul was intelligent, well-educated, and financially successful. He and Linda lived a lifestyle that most could only dream of: expensive vacations, fine dining, a beautiful home that served as the backdrop for what appeared to be a perfect marriage. But those closest to Linda had begun to notice things. Small things. The way Paul would interrupt her when she was telling a story. How he would correct her in front of others, always with a smile, always making it seem like he was being helpful rather than critical. Linda's sister Janet would later recall feeling uncomfortable during family gatherings. Paul had this way of making Linda second-guess herself, she remembered. She'd start to say something and he'd give her this look, and she'd change what she was going to say. It was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. Friends began to realize that Linda rarely made social plans without checking with Paul first. She, who had once been spontaneous and outgoing, began declining invitations, saying Paul preferred they stay home. She, who had once been confident in her opinions, began prefacing her thoughts with "Paul thinks" or "Paul says." The woman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms was slowly becoming smaller in her own home. But outwardly, everything looked perfect. The successful couple in the beautiful house by the sea, living a life that others envied. Until June 9th, when that perfect facade crumbled forever. Paul Curry's call to 911 came at 6:47 a.m. on June 9, 1994. His voice was calm, almost clinical, as he reported that his wife appeared to be unresponsive. "I tried to wake her up for work, and she won't respond," he told the dispatcher, his tone strangely matter-of-fact for a man whose wife was potentially dying in front of him. When paramedics arrived at the Curry home, they found Linda lying peacefully in bed, as if she had simply fallen into the deepest sleep imaginable. There were no signs of trauma, no indication of a struggle, no evidence of any kind of accident or violence. Paul met them at the door, composed and cooperative, answering their questions with the precision of someone accustomed to dealing with emergencies. He explained that he and Linda had gone to bed around 10:30 the previous night. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Linda had seemed perfectly fine. The paramedics worked frantically to revive Linda, but it was too late. She had been dead for hours. At the hospital, emergency room doctors searched for answers. They ran every test they could think of, looking for signs of heart attack, stroke, aneurysm, anything that might explain why a healthy 41-year-old woman would die in her sleep. Linda's medical history was unremarkable. She didn't smoke, rarely drank, exercised regularly, and took no medications. Her last physical exam just months earlier had shown her to be in excellent health. The initial autopsy was equally puzzling. No obvious cause of death. No trauma. No signs of natural disease that would explain her sudden passing. But the toxicology lab would tell a different story. When the results came back weeks later, they revealed something that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Linda Curry had died from acute nicotine poisoning. The levels in her blood were astronomical, enough to kill several people. Nicotine. Not from cigarettes, which Linda didn't smoke. Not from nicotine patches or gum, which she'd never used. Someone had given Linda Curry a massive, lethal dose of pure nicotine. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was murder. And investigators knew exactly where to look first. The way someone responds to the sudden death of their spouse can tell you everything you need to know about their relationship. Most people are shattered, barely able to function, overwhelmed by grief and the practical impossibilities of continuing life without their partner. Paul Curry was not most people. Within hours of Linda's death being confirmed, Paul was on the phone with their insurance company, asking about the claims process. By the end of the week, he had contacted their financial advisor to discuss transferring assets and closing joint accounts. At Linda's funeral, friends and family watched Paul with growing unease. While they sobbed openly, he stood composed, almost serene. He delivered a eulogy that sounded more like a business presentation than a heartfelt goodbye to the woman he'd promised to love forever. He talked about Linda like she was a project that had been completed, one family friend would later recall. There was no emotion, no personal stories, no sense that he had lost the love of his life. It was like he was reading from a script. Even more disturbing was what Paul didn't do. He didn't seem interested in answers about how Linda had died. When detectives asked to interview him about the toxicology results, he was cooperative but detached, showing more curiosity about the technical aspects of nicotine poisoning than grief about his wife's murder. Linda's family was horrified to discover that Paul had already put their house on the market. Less than a month after Linda's death, potential buyers were walking through the home where she had died, while Paul explained that he needed a fresh start. Janet, Linda's sister, confronted Paul about his behavior. "How can you be so calm?" she demanded. "Someone murdered Linda. Aren't you angry? Aren't you devastated?" Paul's response chilled her to the bone. "Being emotional won't bring her back. I prefer to be practical." But perhaps most telling was Paul's reaction when detectives informed him that the investigation had focused on him as the prime suspect. Most innocent spouses would be outraged, demanding to know what the police were doing to find the real killer. They would hire lawyers, call press conferences, do whatever it took to clear their name and find justice for their murdered spouse. Paul did none of these things. Instead, he seemed almost relieved that the mystery had been solved so efficiently. His only concern was whether the investigation would interfere with the insurance payout. As friends and family watched Paul's calculated response to Linda's death, a horrible question began forming in their minds. Was this grief, or was this the behavior of a man whose carefully laid plan had worked exactly as intended? As detectives dug deeper into Paul Curry's background, they discovered that Linda wasn't the first woman in his life to experience mysterious health problems. Paul had been married before, to a woman named Patricia. Friends from that era remembered that Patricia had become increasingly ill during the final months of their marriage, suffering from unexplained nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. She had seen multiple doctors, undergone numerous tests, but no one could determine what was making her so sick. The symptoms had begun gradually. Patricia would feel queasy after meals that Paul had prepared, would experience dizzy spells that seemed to come out of nowhere, would be exhausted even after a full night's sleep. At first, doctors suspected stress from marital problems. Paul and Patricia had been having difficulties, arguing about money and Paul's controlling behavior. But as Patricia's symptoms worsened, she began to suspect something more sinister. She confided to a close friend that she thought Paul might be putting something in her food. The friend had dismissed it as paranoia brought on by a deteriorating marriage. The marriage ended when Patricia finally gathered the strength to leave Paul, moving across the country to live with family. Almost immediately, her mysterious illness disappeared. She regained her health, her energy, her zest for life. Patricia had never connected her recovery to her distance from Paul. She assumed the stress of the failing marriage had been making her sick, and that starting fresh had cured her. She had no idea how close she had come to Linda Curry's fate. When detectives contacted Patricia in 1994, she was shocked to learn about Linda's death and horrified to realize the connection between her own illness and Paul's presence in her life. For the first time, she understood that her decision to leave Paul hadn't just saved her marriage, it had saved her life. Further investigation revealed Paul's disturbing interests. Co-workers at the nuclear plant remembered him being unusually fascinated by discussions of toxicology and poison. He would ask detailed questions about how various chemicals affected the human body, showing particular interest in substances that were difficult to detect. Paul's home computer revealed a browsing history filled with research about undetectable poisons, perfect murders, and famous poisoning cases throughout history. He had bookmarked articles about arsenic, ricin, and various plant toxins, but had shown particular interest in nicotine poisoning. His personal library contained an extensive collection of true crime books, with sections about poison highlighted and annotated in his precise handwriting. Paul Curry wasn't just interested in murder, he was studying it. Friends recalled Paul's arrogance about his intelligence, his belief that he was smarter than everyone around him. He would often make comments about how easy it would be to commit the perfect crime if someone was intelligent enough to plan it properly. Paul thought he was the smartest person in every room, one former colleague remembered. He would make these comments about how stupid criminals were, how they always got caught because they didn't think things through. He acted like murder was just an intellectual puzzle that could be solved with enough planning. The picture that emerged was of a man who believed he was too smart to get caught, too careful to make mistakes, too methodical to leave evidence behind. Paul Curry had been planning the perfect murder, and Linda had been his victim. To understand why Paul Curry chose nicotine as his weapon, you have to understand what made it perfect for his purposes. In 1994, nicotine poisoning was rarely suspected, difficult to detect, and nearly impossible to trace back to the person who administered it. Nicotine is incredibly toxic, more poisonous than many substances that people think of as deadly poisons. A dose as small as 40 to 60 milligrams can kill an adult, and pure liquid nicotine can be absorbed through the skin, making it possible to poison someone without them even knowing they've been exposed. For Paul, a nuclear engineer with access to various chemicals and the technical knowledge to extract and concentrate substances, obtaining pure nicotine would have been relatively straightforward. He could have extracted it from tobacco, ordered it for legitimate research purposes, or synthesized it using his chemistry background. Most importantly, in the 1990s, toxicology tests didn't routinely screen for nicotine unless there was a specific reason to suspect it. Doctors seeing Linda's symptoms, which would have included nausea, dizziness, confusion, and eventually respiratory failure, would have been more likely to suspect heart problems or brain injury than poisoning. As detectives reconstructed Linda's final weeks, a horrifying pattern emerged. Friends and colleagues recalled that Linda had been complaining of feeling unwell for months before her death. She had mentioned dizzy spells, nausea that seemed to come and go, and an unusual fatigue that rest couldn't cure. Linda had seen her doctor multiple times, but the symptoms were vague and intermittent. Blood tests showed nothing unusual, because no one was looking for nicotine. Linda and her doctor assumed she was stressed from work or possibly developing early menopause. Paul, meanwhile, had been the perfect caring husband. He made sure Linda got plenty of rest, prepared special meals when she wasn't feeling well, and even made her herbal tea to help with her nausea. That detail would later prove crucial. Linda's friend Margaret remembered visiting just a week before Linda's death. Linda had been feeling particularly sick that day, and Paul had been attentive, bringing her cup after cup of a special herbal tea blend that he said would settle her stomach. Linda mentioned that the tea tasted bitter, Margaret recalled. She said Paul had to add extra honey to make it palatable. At the time, I thought it was sweet that he was taking such good care of her. Investigators now believe that Paul had been poisoning Linda gradually over the course of several months, giving her small doses of nicotine that made her sick but didn't kill her. This served two purposes. It established a pattern of illness that would make her eventual death seem less suspicious, and it allowed Paul to play the role of the devoted husband caring for his sick wife. The final dose, administered on the night of June 8th, was massive enough to ensure that Linda would never wake up. Paul had calculated the exact amount needed to kill quickly and quietly, without the violent convulsions that might wake neighbors or leave obvious signs of poisoning. He had planned every detail with the precision of an engineer solving a technical problem. Except he had forgotten one crucial element. Even perfect plans leave traces for those who know where to look. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the case against Paul Curry stalled. The toxicology results proved Linda had been murdered, but proving that Paul was the killer required more than suspicion and opportunity. District attorneys need evidence that will convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. They need witnesses, physical proof, a clear chain of events that tells an undeniable story. In 1994, they didn't have enough. Paul had been too careful, too methodical. He had disposed of whatever he'd used to administer the poison. He had alibis for his whereabouts and explanations for his behavior. His grief might have seemed inappropriate to those who knew him, but strange behavior isn't a crime. The case went cold. Paul Curry walked free, returning to his life as if nothing had happened. He sold the house he had shared with Linda, moved to a different town, found a new job. To his new neighbors and colleagues, he was simply a widower starting over after a tragic loss. Linda's family was devastated. They knew Paul had killed her, but knowing and proving are two different things. They watched helplessly as the man they believed had murdered their sister and daughter continued his life without consequences. Janet, Linda's sister, became consumed with the case. She called detectives regularly, asking about new leads, begging them not to give up. She hired private investigators, consulted with forensic experts, did everything she could to keep Linda's case alive. Every day that Paul walked free was another day that Linda's murder went unpunished, Janet would later say. I couldn't let that stand. Linda deserved justice. The years passed slowly. 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998. Paul seemed to have gotten away with the perfect murder. But killers often forget a crucial truth. Time changes everything. Technology advances. Scientific techniques improve. Cases that seem impossible to solve can suddenly crack open when new methods reveal old evidence in a different light. Paul Curry thought he had won. He had no idea that justice was simply waiting for science to catch up. By 2005, forensic toxicology had advanced dramatically from where it stood in 1994. New techniques could detect smaller amounts of substances, identify compounds that had previously been invisible, and analyze samples that had seemed too degraded to be useful. Detective Mike Rodriguez had taken over Linda's case when the original investigators retired. Rodriguez was known for his persistence with cold cases and his willingness to explore new scientific techniques that might crack old mysteries. Rodriguez decided to have Linda's preserved tissue samples reanalyzed using modern equipment. The results were stunning. The new tests revealed not just the massive dose of nicotine that had killed Linda, but traces of chronic nicotine exposure that proved she had been poisoned repeatedly over an extended period. The pattern was consistent with slow, deliberate poisoning followed by a final lethal dose. More importantly, the advanced testing revealed something that 1990s technology had missed: isotopic markers that could potentially trace the nicotine back to its source. The nicotine that killed Linda wasn't from cigarettes or common nicotine products. The chemical signature suggested it had been extracted and concentrated using laboratory techniques, exactly the kind of process that someone with Paul's background would know how to perform. Armed with this new evidence, investigators reopened the case. They began re-interviewing witnesses, looking for details that might have seemed unimportant years earlier but could now prove crucial. Rodriguez also took advantage of another development that hadn't existed in 1994: digital forensics. Paul's old computer hard drives had been stored as evidence, and new techniques could recover data that had been deleted or corrupted. What they found was a digital smoking gun. Paul's computer contained detailed research on nicotine extraction, toxicology tables showing lethal doses for various body weights, and downloaded articles about famous poisoning cases. Most damning was a document titled Project that contained what appeared to be a timeline and methodology for slowly poisoning someone without detection. The file had been created months before Linda's death and modified repeatedly as Paul refined his plan. For the first time since 1994, investigators had not just proof that Linda was murdered, but evidence of who killed her and how. The case that had seemed impossible to solve was finally ready for court. With new evidence in hand, Detective Rodriguez began building an airtight case against Paul Curry. Every detail of Linda's final months was re-examined, every witness re-interviewed, every piece of evidence analyzed through the lens of what they now knew. Margaret, Linda's friend, was able to provide crucial testimony about the bitter tea Paul had served Linda during her final week. She remembered how Paul had seemed almost pleased when Linda complained about feeling sick, how he had insisted she drink more tea to help her feel better. Looking back, it was like he was enjoying watching her suffer, Margaret recalled. At the time, I thought he was being caring. Now I realize he was savoring his control over her. Paul's co-workers from the nuclear plant provided another piece of the puzzle. Several remembered his unusual questions about toxicology and his fascination with undetectable poisons. One colleague, Dr. James Wong, recalled a specific conversation where Paul had asked about nicotine's effects on the human nervous system. He wanted to know how much it would take to cause respiratory failure, Dr. Wong testified. He said he was curious about the safety protocols for working with tobacco extracts. At the time, it seemed like a legitimate workplace safety question. Now it's obvious what he was really asking about. The financial investigation revealed Paul's motive clearly. Linda's life insurance policy was substantial, $750,000, enough to ensure Paul's financial security for years. More importantly, Linda had recently updated her will, leaving Paul everything in the event of her death. Paul had been facing financial difficulties at the time of Linda's death. He had made several bad investments and was struggling to maintain their expensive lifestyle. Linda's death had solved all his money problems instantly. Perhaps most damning was testimony from Patricia, Paul's first wife. She was now able to connect her mysterious illness during their marriage to Paul's poisoning pattern. Medical records from that time showed symptoms consistent with chronic low-dose nicotine poisoning. "He tried to kill me too," Patricia testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "The only reason I'm alive is because I left him before he could finish what he started." Linda wasn't so lucky. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Paul Curry was a cold, calculating killer who had murdered his wife for money and had nearly murdered his previous wife for unknown reasons. He was a predator who used his intelligence and technical knowledge to commit what he believed would be the perfect crime. By early 2010, investigators felt they had enough evidence to finally arrest Paul Curry for Linda's murder. 16 years after Linda's death, justice was finally within reach. March 15, 2010. Paul Curry was now 58 years old, living in a modest apartment in Arizona, working at a different nuclear facility under a cloud of suspicion that had followed him for years. He had never remarried, never seemed to form lasting relationships, living the isolated life of a man carrying terrible secrets. When FBI agents knocked on his door that Tuesday morning, Paul answered calmly, as if he had been expecting this moment for 16 years. Perhaps he had. "Paul Curry, you're under arrest for the murder of Linda Curry," Agent Sarah Martinez announced, reading him his rights as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Paul's response was vintage Paul Curry. Controlled, analytical, showing no emotion. "I assume you have new evidence," he said matter-of-factly. "The toxicology advances, I presume?" Even in his moment of capture, Paul couldn't resist demonstrating his intelligence, his awareness of forensic developments, his belief that he was still the smartest person in the room. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through both California and Arizona. In San Clemente, Linda's former neighbors gathered to discuss the man they had once known as a grieving widower. Many admitted they had always felt something was off about Paul's behavior after Linda's death. "I always thought there was something wrong with how quickly he moved on," said neighbor Helen Vasquez. "Linda was this warm, wonderful person, and he acted like losing her was just a minor inconvenience." For Linda's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Janet, now 16 years older and worn down by years of fighting for justice, broke down in tears when Detective Rodriguez called with the news. "I never stopped believing this day would come," she said through her tears. Linda deserved justice, and finally she's going to get it. But the arrest was just the beginning. After 16 years of freedom, Paul Curry would finally have to face a jury and answer for what he had done. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple. After all this time, would justice finally be served? The trial of Paul Curry began on October 4, 2010, in Orange County Superior Court. The case had garnered national attention, both because of the 16-year gap between the crime and the arrest, and because of the sophisticated nature of the murder itself. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh opened with a statement that laid out the cold, calculated nature of Paul's crime. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case about passion or a moment of anger. This is about a man who decided his wife was worth more to him dead than alive, and who used his scientific knowledge to commit what he believed would be the perfect murder." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the toxicology evidence, The computer files showing Paul's research into poisons, the witness testimony about his strange behavior after Linda's death. They brought in experts who explained how nicotine poisoning works, how Paul would have extracted and concentrated the poison, how he had administered it over months to avoid suspicion. Dr. Emily Chen, a toxicology expert, testified about the levels of nicotine found in Linda's system. The amount we detected would have caused rapid respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. Mrs. Curry would have experienced severe symptoms, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate, possible seizures, before losing consciousness. This was not a peaceful death. Patricia's testimony was particularly powerful. Now in her 60s, she described the mysterious illness that had nearly killed her during her marriage to Paul, and her horror at realizing she had escaped the same fate that befell Linda. "He was patient," she testified. "He would watch me get sick and pretend to be concerned. He would bring me special foods and drinks that he said would help me feel better. I trusted him completely. That trust almost killed me." Paul's defense team, led by attorney Robert Klein, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that 16 years was too long to wait for a fair trial. They suggested that Linda might have been poisoned by someone else, or that the toxicology results were somehow contaminated or misinterpreted. But their case was undermined by Paul himself. Throughout the trial, he showed the same cold detachment that had marked his behavior since Linda's death. He took notes constantly, seemed more interested in the scientific testimony than in his own fate, and showed no emotion when Linda's family described their loss. The jury saw a man who was treating his wife's murder trial like an intellectual exercise. When Paul took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was clinical and unconvincing. He denied poisoning Linda but couldn't explain the evidence against him. He claimed his research into poisons was purely academic curiosity, his financial motives were coincidental, his lack of grief was simply his way of coping. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Walsh exposed the coldness that lurked beneath Paul's intellectual facade. "Mr. Curry, did you love your wife?" "I cared for Linda very much." "That's not what I asked." "Did you love her?" Love is a complex emotion that's difficult to define scientifically. "Mr. Curry, it's a simple question. Did you love Linda?" Long pause. "I believed our relationship was mutually beneficial." That answer told the jury everything they needed to know about Paul Curry. To him, Linda had been a transaction, not a person. When she became more valuable dead than alive, he had eliminated her with the same cold efficiency he would use to solve any other technical problem. On November 18, 2010, after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances for financial gain. Paul Curry showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Even in defeat, he maintained his facade of intellectual superiority. At sentencing, Judge Maria Santos addressed Paul directly. "Mr. Curry, you used your intelligence and your wife's trust to commit a crime of extraordinary callousness. You watched Linda suffer for months, knowing you were causing her pain, knowing you planned to kill her. You are a danger to any woman who might be unfortunate enough to trust you." The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Linda Curry had been dead for 16 years, 4 months, and 9 days when Paul Curry was finally sentenced for her murder. For her family, the conviction brought a sense of closure that had been impossible while her killer walked free. Janet, now 57 and showing the wear of nearly 2 decades fighting for justice, addressed the court during the victim impact phase of sentencing. Linda was more than Paul's victim. She was a daughter who called our mother every Sunday. She was a sister who remembered every birthday and anniversary. She was a friend who could make anyone feel special just by listening to them. Paul saw her as a problem to be solved, but Linda was a person who deserved to live. The case had taken its toll on everyone involved. Detective Rodriguez, who had spent years rebuilding the evidence against Paul, retired shortly after the conviction. "This case taught me that justice doesn't have an expiration date," he said. Linda's family never gave up, and that inspired all of us to keep fighting for her. Paul Curry was transferred to California State Prison, where he remains today. He has never shown remorse for Linda's murder, never apologized to her family, never acknowledged the pain he caused. Prison records show that he spends his time reading scientific journals and working on what he calls theoretical problems. Even behind bars, Paul Curry remains convinced that he's the smartest person in the room. But the Linda Curry case raises questions that extend far beyond one man's crime. How well do we really know the people we share our lives with? How many controlling relationships are actually preludes to violence? How many mysterious illnesses might actually be deliberate poisoning? Linda's story reminds us that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes home with us, sits across from us at dinner, makes us tea when we're feeling sick. Sometimes the person who promises to love and protect us is the one planning our destruction. The most chilling aspect of Paul Curry's crime wasn't its sophistication or its planning. It was its intimacy. He murdered the woman who trusted him most, who had shared her bed and her dreams and her future with him. He killed her slowly, watching her suffer, pretending to comfort her while he planned her final dose. For 16 years, Paul Curry believed he had committed the perfect crime. He had fooled investigators, avoided justice, and moved on with his life as if Linda had never existed. But perfect crimes only exist in theory. In reality, truth has a way of surfacing even after years of being buried. Science advances. Witnesses remember new details. Evidence preserved for decades suddenly tells its story to those who know how to listen. Linda Curry's case was the darkest I've ever covered because it revealed the depths of human calculation and cruelty. But it also demonstrated the persistence of those who refuse to let evil triumph, who fight for years to ensure that victims are not forgotten and killers do not escape. Today, Linda rests in peace, knowing that justice finally found her killer. Paul Curry will spend the rest of his life in a small cell, his brilliant mind finally contained where it can do no more harm. This is the case that will haunt me forever, not because of its brutality, but because of its cold, methodical evil. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who sleeps next to you. And you will never forget it.
Thanks for tuning in to The Witness Wall. If you're new to this channel, kindly like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.